me to clearly state that she is not a legend. She's an author, an activist, and we're all huge fans of her latest work, 470, the solar punk novel. Danielle Wheeler is a Greens councillor who is juggling all of the issues of being a Greens councillor whilst in the context of Western Sydney and the various competing issues that confront a councillor in Western Sydney. And Robyn Francis is very comfortable with being referred to as a legend. She's a teacher, a designer, an activist, and I'm sure very well known to most of you. Please make them welcome.
Wow, this is exciting, a little bit daunting, but how we plan to tackle this panel session. There are 4 of us, and we have deliberately constructed this panel so that we have a really wide range of special expertises, special knowledges, and that means that 45 minutes is not going to be anywhere near enough, so we're going to be skating through some stuff at ridiculous speeds. How we plan to tackle it is each of the 4 of us is going to give a short introduction to we're calling it the 3-minute thesis, if people in academia know. It's kind of, what's your central point in just a couple of minutes? Can you do it? So each of us is going to go through and talk about the central point of our particular expertise and our reason for being on this panel very quickly. And then we have 3 big questions that we thought cover the spectrum of that big question, which is the role of permaculture in addressing the climate emergency. So we have 3 sub-questions, and we're going to address those 3 sub-questions as a panel, which might turn into a free-for-all, because we find that when we start talking, whenever we've started talking about them in practice, we've ended up with this quite, interrupting each other kind of exciting discussion. And so we've devised some strong time limits to try and cut us off. We've given each other permission to say, shut up, sit down, so that we can get through all 3 questions within the time we've got. So that's how we're planning to tackle this whole panel. And so I'm going to invite Chris to do his intro speech.
Slide, please.
Maybe I can change the slide, can I? No? Nothing's happening with the slide. There we are.
Good day. I'm Chris Lucas. I'm a senior research meteorologist, scientist at the unpronounceable agency. So I'm a developing permaculturist. I've been at this for a couple of years, and my wife is quite involved in the scene. But my role is I've been a climate scientist, and I've been a climate scientist my entire adult life, essentially. And I just want to sort of introduce the topic by showing this graph here, which is a temperature record for the last 100 years or so of global temperature. And I just want to make the point that carbon dioxide is a key factor in the climate. And so we can see that in the figure. The green line sort of shows the carbon dioxide concentration, and the red line is the temperature. And you see it tracks pretty closely. They've scaled the plot really nicely, but it also really tracks closely as well. And the sun is that yellow line that I have a hard time seeing. But the sun is not a factor in what's producing the warming that we're observing. So in addition to the carbon dioxide, I think it's important to remember that there are other factors too. There's just natural weather variability in there, and I think we can't lose sight of that fact as well when we do this. So carbon dioxide is the main driver, don't get me wrong, but there are other factors in there as well, and I think that's all I really want to say. I guess the question, what else is going on and what are we going to do about it, is really the essential question that we're going to try to address in this talk.
My 3-minute thesis. While writing 470, I did lot of research about climate science communication and using narrative, using storytelling for climate science communication. So my field of expertise here today is about climate science communication. Alex Steffen, the futurologist, who's not to be confused with Will Steffen, the IPCC author and climate scientist, uses the term personal ruggedisation. And he borrowed the term ruggedisation from the military, and it means turning the need to make systems less brittle and vulnerable into a force for transformation. That is, the problem is the solution. The way he says it is, it's really nice. I want to read the quote. Designing responses to climate change that can mobilise the resources needed for rapid, large-scale change by making those approaches powerful opportunities rather than just protective investments. So what he's saying is people are much more motivated by the opportunity to do something good than by the threat of something bad happening to them. Alex Steffen's not a permaculturist, but to my mind, what he's saying there, what he's talking about there is permaculture. We're all collectively in soft denial of climate change, of the reality of climate change, and the reality of all the other planetary boundary overshoots that we're currently encountering. Climate change isn't the only one. We're in denial, not just in the sense that our Western capitalist system is not sustainable, as in we can't keep doing this forever, but we're in denial that what we're doing, we're actually planet wrecking, as in we're a parasite that's killing its host. The research proposes that there's 3 reasons that we're in soft denial like that much as we say we get it, we're not actually acting like we get it. One of them is the lack of agency. We feel like, what can I do? Poor little human here, what can I do? Especially in the context of the famous 100 companies that are causing nearly all of that dwarf our efforts. Number 2 is that it's a complex problem. They call them wicked problems, where it's really difficult to find an entry point. Everything has feedback loops. Everything that you do creates another thing to do. It's difficult to see what the goal is and what the steps are to reach that goal. So nobody has a beautiful plan that we can all just agree to and say, yep, we'll all do that and that will solve it. Actually, permaculture does, but nobody in the big mainstream does. The third one is the famous quote from Dr. Albert Bartlett. Again, I want to read it. The greatest shortcoming of the human race is our inability to understand the exponential function. Social collapse happens very slowly and then very fast. There's tipping points, there's cascades and compounding. So what that means is that it goes from halfway to a disaster to overshoot over the edge of the disaster in one step. So that doubling of exponential maths means slowly, 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 whoa, that was a big step. And what that means is that it doesn't instinctively feel like we're on the edge of a precipice. It doesn't instinctively, intuitively feel like we're nearly at the point of collapse. What it feels like is we're sort of halfway there, maybe a bit more than halfway there, which, if you understand exponential maths, means that we got 1 foot over the edge. Permaculture has really powerful tools to address all 3 of those reasons why we're in soft denial. We have agency. We have agency to ruggedise our own life, and it's worth doing if for no other reason than self-preservation. And by ruggedising, I don't mean that prepping, go out into the bush, and I mean figuring out ways collectively of making ourselves safer in our own communities, in our own environments. For example, by learning to repair stuff, you are personally making yourself more ruggedised, but you're also, that's what we need to do in mass, is repair stuff rather than buy new stuff. By eating locally, you're ruggedising your own life, but that's what we all need to do, is to eat locally. So it's both adaptation and mitigation at the same time. what that does is that self-efficacy, that feeling that I can do something, I'm not totally powerless, I can do something, gives you hope. And it gets past that feeling of, I don't want to know about it because there's nothing I can do. It allows you to look at the problem with eyes wide open. And permaculture is a really powerful way of creating that ability to look and not have to look away. 2, permaculture teaches systems thinking, so it's ideal for addressing wicked problems. It is ideal for figuring out ways of addressing complex ecological webs so that rather than a single cause and effect chain. And number 3 is exponential change happens in the other direction too. Cascades and compounding can be a positive force. That's what movements are. That's when the joy and, what is it? The meaning and joy in life that you find in permaculture can be contagious, and that can happen exponentially too. That can happen very quickly. So you go from slowly to, whoops, one step is over the edge in a positive direction. That's my 3-minute thesis. I'm going to hand over to Danielle.
Thanks, Linda. Can we have the next slide, please? I'm Danielle Wheeler. I'm a Greens councillor elected to Hawkesbury City Council, which is in the peri-urban fringe of Western Sydney. It's Darug country. It's the land of the Burrabawongal or the grey kangaroo people. What are we doing if we aren't doing permaculture, I think is the big question. And unfortunately, you can't see this really well because of the lighting. On the left on the right is the other left, is PA Yeoman's keyline demonstration property, Yabani, about 10 years ago. In the centre is PA Yeoman's keyline demonstration property, Yabani, in 2021. Looks worse now. That's what we do when we're not doing permaculture. My background's in evidence-based medicine. I did a PDC in 2009 with Ro Morrow and Liz Bastian up in the Blue Mountains because the funding from my medical research job had dried up. And I needed to do something else, and I needed a change. In 2016, I got involved in the Greens about 5 years before that, just in local activism, trying to save places, including this one. This one we failed. A few others, we've won that fight. Local government is pivotal in the fight to not just mitigate and adapt to climate change, but to permaculture the mainstream. Because if we don't, we get the stuff in the middle. If we do, you get the stuff on the left. That's Illabunda, an intentional community in Winston Hills, which is a little bit further in, closer to Parramatta, designed by a family of permaculturists and now houses, I think there's about 35 dwellings on that site, so it houses upwards of 60 plus people. And you can see, if you look at a picture of Illabunda, you can see the properties on either side. Properties that got caught up in getting maximum bang for your buck on those sites. So Illabunda is a very sloping site, similar to Yabani. It's been swaled in exactly the same way and keyline planted in exactly the same way as Yabani was before we dug it all up. Yabani's now got this is called Red Bank, and it happened through corrupt local government and an $18,000 illegal political donation. That's all it cost to destroy this property. $18,000 slipped to somebody. I'm really grateful for Hannah talking about encouraging you to get involved in local politics, because if you don't, it leaves a void. Two things happen in that void. Bad people get to do things while you're not looking, and bad people get to dominate those spaces when you're not in them. So as much as it's not fun, and it's not fun, at the moment I hate it. Like, I can't tell you how much I hate it. And I really appreciate Hannah talking about this morning about those things that lift you up and keep you going, because at the moment for me that's really important. But if I'm not in that space, everything's going to look like the thing in the middle, and I can't live with that. So as much as I can't sleep at night now, I can't. There's no way of going forward. So I play a game that Peter Cundall referred to as play it straight and infiltrate. And that's what I do. I live in a really conservative LGA. It's full of people who, look, we've just had the state election. I ran as the state candidate, and it's my job in those spaces not to get elected, but to change the conversation and to drive it into the direction where we talk about the stuff that's important to us as permaculturists. 10.5% of my electorate voted for One Nation. Another 44% of them voted for the Liberal Party. That's what I'm up against. So if I go in there like a raving greenie, no one pays any attention. So I have to slowly push through that conservative space. When I've got power, I get to do all sorts of things. When I don't have power, like I've not got any at the moment, it's much, much harder. And so I have to be really cluey about how I get through. And it's amazing how frequently permaculture principles come up in that. We've got a waste strategy that's out for public exhibition. I want far more from that waste strategy than it just not costing us very much at the end of the driveway. So I look at all of that from a permaculture perspective. Local government is the key land use planner across New South Wales. So in that space, I've made sure that our planning documents include things that allow houses to be readily retrofitted or to be built with climate change and climate mitigation in mind. And that's the power of being in politics. Because if we don't play in these spaces, social justice goes out the window. We've got enormous disruptive power to make sure that climate justice and social justice are front and centre in the discussions in that space, whether people want to listen to them or not. And readiness is key. My LGA is heavily disaster affected. We've had in some places in our LGA, we've had 6 floods and the Gospers Mountain mega fire in less than 2.5 years. So readiness is now key in our thinking, and that's actually made it easier to get people to talk about mitigation. I don't talk about them necessarily mitigating for climate change, but I talk about them mitigating for disaster, and that's really helpful as well. I'm going to hand to Robyn.
Change the slide. So, I just suddenly feel very overwhelmed. It's been quite a ride, hasn't it, over the past 5 years. 2019, the rainforest, ancient Gondwanan rainforest in the next valley, to me, burnt. That has never had a history of burning. And for the first time, in over 20 years on my property, we had to actually prepare for fire. And then the pandemic hit, and then we're just thinking, okay, we're going to get back on our feet again, and we had the most horrendous flood in history. Any of you who've been to Lismore and you've seen those signs that are metres up in the air on the telegraph poles and stuff, the 74 flood level, well, 2.5 metres above that was what washed our city away. And a lot of homes in the hills, Janelle Schaefer, who works with us at Janbun Gardens, her house, got lost in a landslip and massive disaster. So I want to see how many of you, put up your hand, how many of you have been affected by unprecedented wildfires in the last 5 or 6 years? And how many of you have been impacted by the pandemic in the last 3.5 years? And how many of you were affected by floods last year? That's a lot of us, isn't it? And put up your hand if you didn't put up your hand before. Well, you're very lucky, but it's not going to last, okay? It's a matter of time. And it was incredible how the community pulled itself together, in the face of these disasters. And there's one of the things I really appreciate about Nimbin and also about Lismore, the way we just, self-organise and look after each other, because we've got such a strong sense of community. But it's after the flood, and the really big thing for a lot of people was actually dealing with the grief, the solastalgia. You've heard of nostalgia? Well, nostalgia is sort of a warm, fuzzy feeling for something beautiful that you'd like to go back to sometime, or something from the past, or a home that you've left, or sort of having cups of tea with your grandmother on a back veranda, and warm, fuzzy things. But solastalgia is the grief of something being irreversibly lost and changed and destroyed. And it's what you can actually call your climate grief, when you look at places in the world that are impacted that you might have travelled to or you have a connection with, when you have been devastated and decimated by some form of natural disaster, when your dearest friend's home has been swept down the hill, in a pile of rubble, and fortunately they weren't in it at the time. They were having lunch with a neighbour. So I was actually offering workshops to help people process their grief. And I think, social permaculture has got a lot to offer. We've got to work with people as individuals. We've got to work with communities on this level. And it's really powerful work. I have to really acknowledge some of the pioneers in this field, and people like Joanna Macy and Starhawk, and I've worked with Starhawk on some of these things in the past. And the deep adaptation movement, the extinction movement, and it's a reality. And we can't just sweep our grief under the carpet. We have to own it. And then by owning it and acknowledging it, that can give us the strength and the courage to act, to support each other, to prepare ourselves for future disasters, to get the repair process happening, and to rebuild in a smart and clever way, and to use our skills as permaculture designers, not only in the physical space, but also in the emotional, and I suppose in a way it's a spiritual space, isn't it? And that important connection that we have, and the role of music and the arts and ritual and ceremony, and still finding joy, finding the conviviality that builds community and strengthens the bonds between us is so important. So we've got to share the joy, we've got to share the grief, we've got to share the tears, and we've got to help to build each other up and support each other through this journey. So, working through these heartbreaking realities, through disaster, through the fracturing of our sense of place, and just learning to live with uncertainty and not losing it. I think that is so important. I've seen a lot of friends just crumble because things weren't certain anymore. They weren't dependable. They weren't the way they were before COVID, and then everything was changing as, there was more science coming out about what it is that we face. The same with climate and so many things in life. Life is full of uncertainties. But we have our anchors, and we build on our anchors, and we support each other to dig deep into our resolve and inner strength, and to embrace cultural regeneration and the big shift from the me to the we. In this process of deep adaptation, we can contribute to the positive disintegration of the destructive systems that are assaulting our earth and its capacity to support life. We can facilitate opportunities to work in creative and practical ways to prepare and adapt and mitigate. If we are broken, we will be ineffective. So we need to stand strong together. So that's what I wanted to share.
Can we have a new slide? This is the first of the 3 questions that we wanted to address as a panel. What does permaculture look like when we're playing for real? How do we permaculture the mainstream? How do we change permaculture from being a marginal organisation, much as the margins are the value? How do we change permaculture? How do we move it into the mainstream? There's a whole field of green growth that's being talked about. There's a guy called Jacobson who started that whole conversation with some numbers about how it might be possible to live the same way that we're living in this Western capitalist system that's doing so much damage, just by replacing the sources of energy with green sources of energy, with renewable sources of energy. There's a couple of Australian scientists who've done some really good work in that space, just in number crunching, who are going, no way, no hope, long way off it. The numbers say that there's only about 20% of our energy use comes from household use, from heating, cooling, cooking, hot water, light, all the kind of things that we as individuals can do a lot about on our own. 80% of our energy use goes into mining, manufacturing, transport, cement, steel, plastic, ammonia. So if we think it's not just a matter of no new coal mines, it's a matter of no new cement, no new steel, no new ammonia for fertilisers, no new plastics. Think about what the kind of changes that would have to happen for that to happen. But that's our question number 1. Off we go.
I think it's going to be quite difficult. Yeah, I don't actually have much thoughts. You've summarised it quite well. So.
I'm going to... Is that working? Yep. I'm going to talk just a tiny bit about the political space, because that's the space where we go out and we pitch to you when politicians want to be elected. And the trouble with the magnitude of this problem is that nobody actually wants to give anything up. And so the idea that we have... You've got 2 choices, and the Greens are probably more honest than than the mainstream political parties, and I say that with a large dose of bias. We probably try to cover both bases. We have the radical change end of our policies, and we have the soft sell, where we tell you that get an electric car, make your house fully electric, get solar panels, build solar farms, more public transport, free public transport, all of this stuff. And they're all part of the solution, but we don't stand up in public and say what you actually need is a radical rethink of how capitalism has shaped our society, because it's not gonna work. And we're too gutless to do that, because we know that we can't sell it and will be obliterated publicly. So for our own preservation, we sell out everybody else's preservation, which is probably where Chris is going to come in.
I agree. I think it is a very difficult situation, and there's lots of problems unfolding now, weather-wise and in terms of the climate, and we're seeing the impacts and we're starting to see the change. But we're, as you say, we're not going to get there halfway. We have to really change our life, I think, completely. And
yes, I tried it, but it wasn't working. This slide, I like this slide in there. This is actually a story. This is passenger pigeons in the USA. And do people know the story of the passenger pigeon? This is a flock of passenger pigeons. It's an artistic rendering of it, but it's an artistic rendering of photos that were taken at the time. Passenger pigeons were present in the billions and billions and billions. There were flocks of them that flew over USA that were so dense and so huge that the entire sky would go black with them. The stories about the numbers of passenger pigeons are incredible, but they were good. They weren't even great eating. They were pigeons, people eat pigeons, but they were good for sport shooting. And so they became a favourite for sport shooters when white people came to USA. And over the period of, it's up there as an example of exponential functions. Passenger pigeons decreased, what's the numbers? I forget them now. But they decreased by, from several billion to 500,000 over the period of a century or so. And you think about those numbers, 500 million to 1 billion to 500,000. If you can get your head around maths, that's a huge loss in numbers. But it didn't feel like a huge loss in numbers. There's still 500,000 passenger pigeons in the sky. You can still look up and see a lot of them. And so people weren't actually very, Then passenger pigeons dropped in numbers with that exponential function really fast. From that, they dropped to a lonely pair of passenger pigeons. They dropped to about 50 within less than a decade, and then to the last pair within a couple of years. So that, the first stage went for a century, last stage went to this. And it actually wasn't that the rate of change changed so radically, it was the rate of human perception of the change happened really radically. And then there was Martha, that was the very last passenger pigeon. Poor old Martha lived on her own in a zoo for 5 years as the last of her species. But that quote, how did you go bankrupt, comes from Ernest Hemingway, and it's the same concept. 2 ways, gradually and then very suddenly. And I think that's what we're looking at with permaculturing the mainstream, is getting that consciousness through that what we're looking at is exponential change. We're looking at the possibility of a very fast social collapse. I lived in Cuba for most of a year in '98. That was at the end of the special period. And Cubans went within 6 months from living like middle-class Australia, lower middle-class Australia, is probably the way most of us live, not particularly rich, but you can walk into the supermarket and, the shelves are stocked, you can buy what you want, to being starving, to the fact that there were no pigeons left at all in Havana streets. And they went from that in 6 months. So you imagine what your life would be like to go within 6 months from supermarket shopping to trying to get the last of the pigeons for dinner. The toilet paper situation, yeah.
Yeah.
Shall we change slide?
Yeah.
Or does anyone else want to carry on with that one? The last thing I wanted to say about permaculture in the mainstream too is this is off track, this is on a different track, but it's about the potential of permaculture in mainstream education, which is something that Permaculture Australia has been doing, is moving permaculture concepts into those areas like plumbing and electricians and builders and carpenters and, you know, all the mainstream occupations having a permaculture bent to them.
Yeah, well, the vocational training, what we call APT, the Accredited Permaculture Training, and it's exactly 20 years ago this year that we actually got our suite of vocational qualifications accredited. And now we've got a re-accreditation there on the National Training Register. The certificate 1 and 2 can go into schools, into high schools. There's huge opportunities there. And with the latest round of re-accreditation, we've got horticulture and agriculture going, hey, you know, your unit on soil or your unit on compost or your unit on this is so much better than ours. And so they are actually starting to adopt permaculture. My good friend and colleague Danielle has gone to Bingra in Western New South Wales, working for the, it's called the Living Classroom. It's supported by 2 universities, helping farmers make the transition to regenerative and sustainable agriculture. I mean, she's got a science degree, she's got a master's degree. It was her permaculture that got her the job, because they needed somebody with a holistic view. So, yeah, look, it's not about mainstreaming permaculture, it's about permaculturing the mainstream. We've got a lot of agency. We've got a lot of edges that we can push in that respect.
Which brings us to the end of capitalism, which is a very appealing outcome, I think, for lots of us. And I think we got a little bit of a glimpse, I think, of what could happen with COVID, where we started to do this. We adapted remarkably quickly to the things that were required to get us through that 3 or 4 months in order for the world to keep making money. And that's what we really focused on the whole time. But what it taught us was that we can actually pivot quite effectively if we want to, using the tools that mostly we already had. You know, I don't think Zoom knew that they were going to be at the forefront of an international revolution and the staggering, no doubt, financial gains that they got from it. But you can see here the other big global disruptor. So this was your slide. I think these are all stuck in a flood, these shipping containers. So there's a middle point between this revolution disguised as organic gardening and the end of capitalism, because the story that we've almost got comfortable with the idea that we just can't fix this, that it's so bad that we should just pull our heads in and, you know, and move on. You know, I've got friends whose children are in their early 20s and they're deciding not to have children because life will be too bad. We are probably one of the few species who can look at whether we have the agency over our own birthing, and to think that you will just deliberately not bring a child into the world because of the mess that we've made of it that's a staggering realisation.
So I was just going to say that the problem is the solution. That the genesis of that slide was the idea that climate change and climate disasters actually might be the solution, not the problem. There's the solution, because they make us. They force the issue of moving away from capitalism. They force that issue of, you know, it's harder to. They change it. It's now easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. Climate change might just change that one around so that it becomes easier to imagine the end of capitalism, simply because if a climate disaster stops that kind of shipping containers, stops up supply chains like that, if it crashes the economy in ways by no more cement, no more steel, forcing us to think of other ways of doing that. If it makes us repair stuff rather than buy new stuff, because the new stuff is stuck in a port in China somewhere by some disaster, if it forces that issue, it might force us to imagine the end of capitalism, which is really the thing that we need to do. And I mean capitalism in that sense of that corporate capitalism, growth economy, more and more and more stuff, which is what we need to do in a bigger way.
Yeah. So, it's really about reimagining ourselves, isn't it? And it's one of the things that is really big with Rob Hopkins and the transition movement. And something that actually we did in Nimbin, must be 15 years ago almost. We ran a series of community workshops called Imagineering, and looking at where we wanted to be in the future, and out of that sort of came a whole range of initiatives, and with the result that we can source 80% of our food needs within a 30-40 kilometre radius now, and with food security and energy security, and just bringing the community together in that way. I think a lot of the resistance is people are terrified of what they might lose. The fear of missing out. There's too much FOMO-ism happening around. And what we've got to spread is the joy of what we gain. When we make it, we bake it, we mend it, we come together as communities to solve our problems and to share and get a gift economy happening and support each other. And the important thing there is that we need to look at how we can adapt, but ensure that those actions of adaptation are mitigating the problem and not exacerbating it. And it's easy to be a prepper and just sort of like consume your safe space somewhere in the hills, but is it really mitigating? Is it going to help solve things into the future?
Can we change the slide? The next slide that I think Chris really wants to...
Yeah.
Right. So this is a slide of sort of 9 or 10 different climate change areas and environmental impacts, I think, is really what it is. So climate change is one of them, and it's sort of halfway. And, halfway is pretty scary as it is. But you look at some of the other ones, we have biospheric integrity, and that's land degradation and that sort of thing. And that's already maxed out, according to these authors. We look at biogeochemical flows down at the bottom. That's nitrogen and phosphorus. That's what we put on our food to help it grow. They're maxed out. That's running off into the ocean, and that's creating all kinds of problems out there. We have novel entities. That's a bit vague, but what that is it's cement use and things like that in the atmosphere. And that's maxed out. Some of the other ones, we have stratospheric ozone depletion. We look to have taken care of that one mostly, but there's still some danger. But water use and climate is a major issue, but there's all these other sort of related issues that are part of the climate as well that also need to be addressed. And I think permaculture is one of the answers to getting at that. It's a whole system approach. It's not just cutting carbon dioxide and building an electric car. It's doing all these other things that we need to do to really address the problem.
Yeah, that's it. It's that climate change will force us to address all those other planetary boundaries, which are actually threatening us just as much,
If not more.
if not more at this point, in the short term. But
Next slide.
next slide. Can we have the next slide? No, we jumped then. We want the Hey, there we go. The question 3 slide.
We've sort of pretty much
Which
done our raves on that, haven't we?
Robyn was going to introduce, and she ran ahead with it. The question 3 was, is it important to adapt? Are we already at the point where what we need to be doing is adapting to what is coming at us, like a freight train? Or is it important to mitigate? So it's, and it's a false dichotomy, I know, but that that goes to the question of whether adapting is a waste of time, or whether we all should be doing Extinction Rebellion stuff, whether the energy should be going into radical activism or into, shit, how am I going to live in this new world that's coming at us quickly? So that's our question 3. Who wants to have a go? Robyn's already had a go at that one.
Sorry, I jumped the gun there.
What I want to say about that one is that there's another bit of research about hope, and I think Hannah talked a little bit about this morning too, that there are 2 kinds of hope. There's the kind of hope that is one door closes and another one opens, and the universe is looking out for me, and that kind of hope that is, I think the slide you use is buying a lottery ticket. It's the hope that everything will work out. Cross your fingers, close your eyes, and just hope something will work out. Hopium. There's the other kind of hope that is built on, I know what I've got to do, I can do it, I've got a plan, it may not work, but I know how to go forward, and I think that's what Hannah was calling gumption this morning. There's some really, really good, solid research that second kind of hope leads to action. The first kind of hope leads to paralysis. It leads to people just sitting and waiting for something to happen. But the second kind of hope leads to action. And I think that's what permaculture gives us, is it gives us something that we can do, a solid plan of something that we can do that might not work, but looks awfully like it's got some good ideas in there that are going to take us through all of these challenges. And more important than anything else, it gets past, Guy and Toad mentioned this too, it gets us into that zone where you're not paralysed, where they called it something, and I made a note of it because it was such a good thing. Trauma-informed, yeah. That's my take.
And I think that trauma-informed lens is really useful, because in the community that I live in now, we are all traumatised. Some people are less traumatised than others, but we, after 6 natural disasters and a pandemic, within 2 years, we're all a little bit at breaking point, and it spills over then into everything. We're more short-tempered, we're more short-sighted, we are not functioning in the same way that we did before. And it's really useful, I think, to notice that. If you're working in that change-making space and you can notice where people are coming from, following those traumas, and people are just now living with the idea that the bubble is bursting. You know, we're about to see, I think, a greater economic storm as well, and we're already seeing that where I live in Western Sydney, where people are generally poorer than Sydney as a whole. Permaculture has an enormous power to help adaptation and mitigation in that space, because our solutions aren't expensive. They're really accessible, and I would argue that if they're not accessible to people without resources, then they're not adaptive anyway, and we probably should move along from them. You know, the idea that we should all be able to afford 5 acres to fix up the mess that we've created, that's long past. People are flat out affording a balcony, and I think we need to make that really clear, that the days of everybody sitting down and designing their own property on a PDC, really they've gone. We need to be designing for community.
Yeah. We've also got to be very realistic about what we can do to mitigate. I mean, it's been really interesting in Lismore, the narrative since the big flood last year. And there's sort of this school of thought that, let's mitigate future floods by putting dams on all the catchments, you know, or why don't we just dig a great big channel for the river to bypass Lismore? But you've got a bottleneck of 1,200 square kilometres of catchment coming through a really narrow valley where Lismore is, and you get, 500 millimetres of rain in 24 hours. No number of swales or dams or even planting trees is going to mitigate that. You have to adapt. You've got to, be strategic with what you do. And I mean, at the same time, with our adaptation, we've got to make sure we're not making the situation worse for the future.
Next slide, please. So this is a slide from the United States that shows sort of weather disasters and their cost and billion-dollar weather events in the United States from 1980 through recent times. It's been adjusted for inflation and all that. And I guess what the figure shows is there's kind of a constant, but they're really increasing. And the green line is increasing the most since about 2006 in this figure. And those are severe storms, weather disasters, hurricanes, tornadoes, and that sort of thing. And those seem to be hitting, well, there's more people, and they seem to be hitting more economically sensitive areas, I guess is a way of putting it. I think that's maybe not truly reflective of the change. In some sense, you think back a couple of weeks ago, we had a Category 5 tropical cyclone come into northwest Australia, and you heard about it for a day on the news, and then it disappeared because it didn't hit anything. It did no damage to human valued properties. It did lots of damage to the environment. It's a Category 5 tropical cyclone. It did damage, but and I think we need to, I think what I see of this, and we all kind of disagree on this, is that, we need to be careful about what we count and how we count things and what matters. It's not just the human values that matter, it's the natural environment that matters too. And, I think perhaps a more inclusive way of looking at things might be a better way to go about it. But I'll let the others give their opinion too. So.
Let's change slide. Unless somebody else.
Yeah, no, move
We're
on.
running out of time.
Yeah.
Can we have the next slide? This
Yep.
is our last
So
one. This is our last one. People would have seen that one. It's been popping up on social media around the place. But I think that's the essence of the argument, is that permaculture is a way of living extremely well. And there's a word for it is eudaimonia, which means the good life, well lived, with enough but not too much of everything. And I think permaculture and that can be contagious. That sense of living well with all the good stuff can be its own tipping point. It can cascade and compound as quickly as the bad stuff into a world that is very different. And that's the essence of climate change. Can be an opportunity to realise that better world.
So, any questions?
And I think we're up to our time for questions. So.
Thank you. Is that working? That was a fabulous panel presentation. Thank you, all of you. Danielle, you mentioned, and it really resonated with me, the fact that we need to move away from thinking permaculture on 4 acres and start to think about people in a unit with a balcony. And Mollison and Holmgren in their very first book talked about the fact that a 1/4 acre block could feed a family of 4. And we have moved away from that. How do we get the notion of growing your own food into the homes of people with a very limited space? How do we get to the unconverted?
I actually think that's easier where people live in denser communities. So one of the big barriers that we've got out where I live, where we're sort of the last vestiges of the 1/4 acre block out in peri-urban Sydney, and the houses that are being built now are being built on about 300 square metres, and it's probably 280 square metres of house with enough, if you're lucky, for a clothesline. And I mean, I don't know what you do if you've got a dog. Clearly you don't kick a ball to it or anything. But all of those people think that they've got land if they want it. It's the really successful community gardens aren't where I live. They're in places where people live in much denser spaces. And I think in Western Sydney, and in other areas, usually areas of socioeconomic disadvantage, it's where you tap into people's need for community, so that want to connect to society, to more social interaction, but also to share. So I think we've got this idea that people are awful, you know, and the game that I play, you know, in politics is full of a lot of very awful people, and it makes you really cynical and bitter and twisted. But actually people, I think, are essentially quite good. And if you appeal to their sharing nature, or they're sharing their knowledge, their cultural understanding, you know, instead of what's in it for me, what have you got for everyone else? Lots more people come to the table when you pose that question. Permaculture Sydney West, I think, is the triumph of that, of getting people out of their own heads and into a sharing space with other people, where they've done exactly that with very few financial resources.
I've moved from off-grid large homestead into a tiny suburban lot, and in a very, very multicultural area where a lot of refugees, and I'm finding it's easier to grow food and to share food and to create community and to lower my whole impact in that community than it is off-grid. It's amazing. Surprised me.
Giving city dwellers all their own patch of land just makes urban sprawl. It doesn't make better communities. It just spreads everybody out further on agricultural land.
Okay, thanks everyone. Robyn, Danielle, thank you. That was a terrific discussion. Point running through my head at the moment, I have heard recently without evidence, but it seems it could be extremely true in relation to the passenger pigeon, which is that biodiversity is as great, if not a bigger threat, than the climate crisis which we are now in and feeling the early stages, which are nothing to what the next stages will be. If this is true, then the urgent need to put back habitat should drive us into action the moment we get home, because without that biodiversity, we all go. I'm talking about industrial crops and gardens and everything. Second point that I have is just a little more global. There are two countries I'm thinking about that are having to manage the most extraordinary extremes of climate emergency: Bangladesh, in particular the Bangladesh Association of Sustainable Development, and the Philippines, where Green Relief and other permaculturists are working. In both those organisations, I would imagine, as communities and populations, they're far, far better prepared than we are. We've got helicopters and we've got government, and we can get the army there to an extent, and then it stops, because we'll run out of resources to do that with multiple disasters and with global warming. The big thing is they're training their communities, community after community. I remember years ago in Vietnam saying, oh, there's a cyclone, can I go down and help? I went down to help, but they locked me in a classroom all night, but they had sandbagged and prepared and knew exactly what to do. In Bangladesh recently, Greta was there, and this is her story. I don't know if she's here. But she said to them, what are you doing about disaster? They said, we don't have disasters, we know what to do. We've got this strategic program about animals, water, safety, clothes, and everyone knows. In the Philippines, the moment a cyclone goes over, they go out, they sort the dangerous, they sort the rubbish, they sort the compost, and they start again. Now, I think our population, I'm stopping, okay, is remarkably ill-equipped on an individual community basis, and the other thing is we have to tell some people to move. We cannot say you can go on living there and mitigate or adapt, you'll have to go, right? So I think that's part of our message as well. Okay.
That was the 2 minute bell. That was not the final bell, that was the 2-minute bell, and I do have one more question for the panel over here.
Thank you. My name is Ego Lemos. As Chris has mentioned, that the climate change is mostly caused by the carbon dioxide. So what do you think about the program that called carbon trading or carbon sequestration? Is that help or not? Thank you.
Is that happening? Is that what you asked? I think they're trying to make it happen. I'm not sure if it's really happening or not, and I'm not sure if it's really a solution or not. I mean, I don't know, to tell the truth. It could work, but if it actually lowers the amount of carbon we use, but if it's just shifting the numbers around and making someone money, then I'm not sure it's really an answer.
An analogy for like carbon trading would be fidelity trading. You know, I'll pay you, I'll pay you to be true to your partner and don't screw around with anybody else, and that gives me license to be as free as I like.
I can say confidently from a local government perspective that offsetting of any form is bullshit.
And I want to say that it misses the point. It misses the opportunity that climate change gives us to address all the other planetary boundaries. So even if it did work, it'd actually be the problem, not the solution.
It is the problem because it's an invention of unfettered capitalism, and all it does is allow capitalism to thrive. So what it says is, I'll destroy this bit, I'll pay you a little bit so that you spend a lot not destroying that other bit that you weren't going to destroy anyway. That's how it works.
Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. I'm not sure Robyn Francis didn't just sell me on carbon credits. Fidelity credits. Now we're talking. You're in? Okay. Thank you so much for joining us. Will you please give our panel a warm and generous round of applause?